government communications and mastering the art of storytelling. In this session, we're going to be discussing how government communication has adapted, needs to adapt, and what are the tools that we can use effectively to communicate to wider audiences from a government's perspective. We have two wonderful speakers and some of those working at the forefront of communications, but in different ways. So Margery Kraus, founder and executive chairperson of APCO, who, as I said to her when I met her earlier today, is a legend in communications and very well known to this region, but I believe based in DC.
Yes, our headquarters, Washington, DC.
And here also is Stephen Bartoni, and he is the assistant managing editor of Forbes, but also editor of 30 Under 30. So somebody who will know exactly how to speak to a younger audience, but also knows what those under 30 are excelling at and how you can reach them. Right, so thank you both for being here. Government communications is always challenging, but also there are so many opportunities now in the modern era with modern tools of communication. And so Margery, I wanted to start with you and what you see as the best examples of communications by governments and what are the most sophisticated tools that are out there today?
Well, I think that, and thank you for having us, this is a great topic, especially in this region where I think people are just learning the power of interactive communications. I think for a long time, government communications existed of sending out information. You didn't know how it was received, you didn't know how it was interpreted, you just sent out information. It's what governments did. And I think what's been discovered over the last few years is that the importance of communication being interactive and having tailored communications to different audiences so that the information is received in the way you want to receive it. That, by necessity, has required a few things. Governments need to be open and more transparent and less worried about giving out information. I think there was always this hesitation to maybe have more of a conversation and less of a fact sheet. And so I think that's one way things have changed a lot. I think the tools are also tremendously different. Many governments now are learning how to use all the techniques of digital communication. And I think in that way, the governments in this region have actually been more advanced than some other governments. My government, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that I've been very impressed with the use of apps for information, with the use of, the ability to use social media channels. And I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I think the last piece of this that I've seen is that governments are moving also to more branded content where they can put out stories to illustrate the kinds of things that they're doing so that people, and this is where storytelling becomes really important, to try to capture the imagination of their different constituencies about what the real goal is and what they're trying to accomplish over time. But we can get into this more. I'm sure that
Yeah,
Stephen has some thoughts.
Because Stephen, I mean, the point of communications is it could be basic information, so traffic information, and it could be actually convincing and cajoling and putting out political messaging. So how are governments best equipped to tackle the difference between just putting out information or having that conversation and making it much more two-way and much more about convincing rather than just disseminating information?
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, and this is great to be here. Well, show of hands here. Who in this room gets a physical newspaper delivered every day to their homes? Who gets a magazine still in physical paper? As we see, the world's going digital, right? Yeah. And this is about digital. It's not just messaging, it's about storytelling. And there's so many ways for governments and everyone to tell stories. Like, no one wants to hear a directive from a government, a state. They want to hear, there's a way of finding examples, telling stories, success stories, and it's all digital. It's all broken down now with, obviously, Twitter is such an amazing way for not just the federal government, but you have politicians, you have governors, mayors, all that stuff. Instagram's a great way to kind of, again, like visually tell stories. TikTok's reaching a whole other generation. So the tools are changing every few months, but the key is to be transparent and authentic, and no one, and that's tricky too because no one wants like a bureaucrat trying to be authentic on TikTok. That's not going to work. So you need proxies in a way of stories, maybe celebrities, maybe it's a media company that believes in one thing you're doing, and you tell through proxies. But the key is not just to write billboard signs. It's about somehow telling a human story and hopefully convincing people to do that, at least in the States.
But you smiled, and I did too, the minute you said about some bureaucrat wanting to be fun or cool, and it backfires because it's the wrong messaging. And I can think of at least 3 examples off the top of my head. So how does a government entity avoid doing that? If they don't want to use celebrities, if they want to be transparent and directly communicate, what is the best way to not be that cringeworthy civil servant?
I think the best way is, again, to be authentic. So if you need to hire young folks, you got to hire the demographic and the community, whether it's age or where you're from, and have those people put their touch on it. Otherwise, it's going to seem kind of tone deaf. But it's very tricky, and a lot of media companies and governments try and fail all the time.
Margery?
Yeah, I think that it's not necessarily about hiring those people. It's about having ambassadors or intermediaries that can carry that message. Because I think authenticity is the coin of the realm, if you will. Because if you are giving out information and it's not believable, you do more damage than good. So if you can, if you're putting out a message to young people, for instance, using young people to deliver that message, I think is really important. And I think trying to capture the character and tone is important. And I think COVID is a great example of not only the importance of how government communicates, one, because information was essential and it kept changing. I think how it got delivered was whether it was believable or not. As you look around the world and see what countries did well and which ones didn't do as well, I think the method of delivery was an important part of that. And then who delivered it. In certain places, government was well respected and could deliver it. In other places, you had to go to the stakeholders that aligned with the groups you were trying to reach, whether it was women, whether it was kids, whether it was, for frontline workers or whatever. So I think matching the message, and that's why, you come back to how do you how are you authentic and giving out good information but still controlling information? That's really the challenge, I think, of getting this right.
Yeah, just to add on that, it's interesting too, like you have to have many stakeholders, but also whether you're a government or a media company, you have to use all the tools in your toolbox. Like there's no one way to do it anymore. Just like kind of a story with Forbes, like I was an intern at Forbes 13 years ago, and back then Forbes magazine printed 28 issues a year on dead trees, and if you're a subscriber, you got it. If you're saw it on the newsstand, you got it. At his side, we had Forbes.com. We had a firewall between both of them, and they would just make slideshows. Remember those slideshows back like 15 years ago? Like all black clicks. And our goal was to get that on, AOL and get that on, on the web. Now we're kind of like 5-dimensional journalism. So every story, you can write a quote magazine story, but it's online. It's going to get disseminated and chopped up on YouTube and Twitter and TikTok. It'll be in person. We do communities. We do live events. That's another way of journalism. Like right now, we're doing kind of live journalism. So, a government and any media company needs to, basically hit every flavor, and they have to hit every single every single way to just every single platform of media, and they're different. Like a magazine story looks great, but it has to be switched to work well on Twitter. It has to be switched again to work well on Instagram. So you have to have all the recipes.
So Stephen, can I ask you, so that distinction between it's the same story but you tell it in different ways is quite important also for people that you're interviewing from government. So if government has a major announcement they want to do, for them to understand that there will be, this great interview that you'll do with the principal, but then there's ways to disseminate that information, be it Insta story or TikTok or otherwise. So how much do you recommend governments understand that? Or is it not for them to worry about? They should trust the media partners to figure that one out.
Oh, I don't know. There's so many ways. There's so many different governments are different. And like in America, for example, like some politicians are very social media savvy. Everyone from AOC to love him or hate him. Donald Trump was a very effective communicator on Twitter. He basically bypassed the entire media establishment. Now Biden's back to more the traditional thing. So it's so tricky to do it, and it's so personal. it's really difficult. But you have to, again, be authentic and understand who your audience is and find a way and also target. The beautiful thing with digital is you know what's being received. You know the comments. You know who's opening it. You know who's sharing it. So there's a great way to kind of A/B test on like, oh, this worked really well, and oh, we got to tweak it in this way. So you're always got to be experimenting. And now that you can track, if you put it on a newspaper, you didn't really know who was reading and how. Now you know who, where, what device they're reading it on. So there's a great feedback that you need to build on. If you ignore that, you're just kind of like walking around blind.
Margery, I want to pick up from that because as a newspaper editor who wishes more hands went up when you asked how many people get physical newspapers, how much of it has to be guided by what people want? And that could be also tricky because it could be a race to the bottom. Unfortunately, general mass audience interests are not necessarily what you may want to get out to them. So how much do you have to play that between what you want to put out, but also knowing your audience and make sure that you're catering for what they would want? How do you strike the balance?
I think that it starts with you. What information needs to be out there? But I think you have to be cognizant of how it gets received by the various audiences, because people don't always know what they want. They know what they don't like, I think is probably better. So I think it's really important to try to understand that targeting that Stephen talked about is more important than ever. Knowing, how do you take the message to where your audience is? And how do you find those platforms where you can have that dialogue and that commonality? And I think that's where you come up with the way in which it's very segmented. And, we have another dichotomy going on because in this part of the world especially, that what you need for local consumption is very different than what will play globally. And you want to, since we have these digital tools that are global tools, and once something is on the internet, it's a global story. You have to also keep in mind how you balance what is important in the region versus what is important in the world, and how you come up with the way to tell that story so that you get the results that you want. So I don't think you can just do an assessment of what you think people want to hear, because that will get you in trouble. I think if you can't walk the talk, don't put it out there.
So Stephen mentioned two really well-known American politicians online, and here in this part of the world, there are many officials and politicians that also use Twitter, primarily Twitter, but other social media tools to communicate with audiences. So I wanted to ask you first, and I'll come to you, Stephen, with the same question, which is, you have the problem of some officials who don't want, and some governments who don't want to be exposed like that because they're scared of making a mistake. Then you have the flip side, who you almost have to be like, no, you cannot play with this toy because you're going to cause real problems for us. So what's your advice for both scenarios?
It's an interesting thing because we come up with this every day with the governments that we work with, because on the one hand, governments' need and desire to control the message causes a chain of command inside an organization that by the time you put it on Twitter, it's no longer relevant.
Right.
You have to have a certain kind of system that trusts that the people who are given license to be out there are trained and know how to use the elements. You can't just, it's not an either or. You can't just say, we want everybody to be transparent and tweet away. No organization can do that. You have to have some controls in place. On the other hand, if your controls, especially within government agencies, require several chains for a tweet to go through, and we've come up with this, and then people complain that their message isn't out there, because by the time it's ready to go, it's not relevant anymore.
Right.
These tools are meant for fast action, and you have to develop systems internally and do the necessary training to make sure that these systems are used in the correct way.
Stephen, same question. I mean, if it could be also journalists. Some journalists are really avid and on social media and very excited to be there, and others don't want to touch it. So how do you strike that balance of making sure who they're representing doesn't get burnt in the process, but also they represent? Yeah,
I'm on the latter side. I'm not on social media as much as I would like to be, but I think some people are naturally good at this, and they're kind of the rock stars. They're just naturally good posting. But so many people that we don't like, so many of government officials and celebrities, like they have whole teams doing this. So they have PR agencies doing this. So it looks like this person and that person's tweeting, but no, like there's been 5 people that have run through this all, and it's all another form of marketing. It's very, it's very tricky. So you got to pick your spaces. Like very few people are naturally good at it, and also it can become very tricky because the world's America, for example, is so polarized. So if you're on social media all day, you end up just on Twitter, have to react to people. You're fighting, arguing. No matter what, there's people, no matter what they say, 50,000 people will attack them for they can say hello, good morning, and they're getting attacked. So it's very important to get the message across, but you also, it can be a very bad time suck, and you're kind of living in this Twitter bubble and just reacting to what people are saying online, whether they're fans or trolls. So it's a difficult balance because you can spend all day on social media, think you're working, and you're just kind of spinning your wheels. So that's right, Margery? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this part of the world, I think there's a desire to use these social media channels for a lot more marketing than the political discussions.
Yeah.
And, and I think that has been pretty effective for some parts of government to be able to get there, especially on attracting things, big on the mega projects and getting there to be interest. Well, if you look at Expo as an example, and I think that kind of contagiousness has actually served the governments pretty well.
I want to go.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So you're here in Emirates, which it's such a dynamic, amazing international place. It's you ask someone every 5 years the landscape's changing. Like you've been here in media.
Every 5 months.
5 months is changing. So you're editor-in-chief of of the National. Like so, how has your organization and job and communication changed in a country that's physically changing so fast? I can't imagine the digital change. Like, what's your view been?
It's funny what you were saying about audiences because for us, we love the physical paper, but less than 1% of our readership is actually seeing the physical paper because we only distribute it in the UAE, and most people in the UAE are on their mobile phones. 80% of our readership is on mobile. So what we decided to do is have 6 different digital editions. So depending on where you are, you're geotagged. So if you're in the GCC or UAE, you get one edition. If you're in the UK, you get an edition in the US. So you kind of segment it, and that's kind of the beauty of digital communications. But like you said, we'll put a story out. It really doesn't matter where we decide to put it, what edition. Once it's online, people will find it if they want to, and it can crop up. But it is incredible being in the UAE and the speed of change. And I think that's also one of the challenges for governments, not only in the UAE, but everywhere in the world, that change is happening so quickly. Technological change is happening, but also trends and people's interests. So I wanted to talk about that. Like, what trends do you foresee? If we were to look at, if you were planning in any of the government entities, or if you're in media, and you were thinking, okay, in the next 5 years, I'm not going to say 10 years because I think that's way too far in the future for technology and the speed of change. But in the next 5 years, what would be the trends you'd say we need to be on top of?
Well, I think one thing that needs to be explored is metaverse.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's talking about this. What is that really going to mean? How does, is there a positive way to use it to create dialogue, to actually have people meet from country to country and try things out in a digital way before it's actually in reality? And so I think that one of the things that governments are going to have to start thinking about are these new tools and how do they impact on what they're doing. And that's one thing that you hear more and more about, and nobody really understands.
Well, we have a Metaverse Forum here at the World Government Summit that I'm moderating tomorrow from 2 p.m. So hopefully I'll have some answers. You should show up. Yeah.
But I was in Mexico City right before I came here, and I was at one of the universities, and they were actually teaching a course about marketing on the Metaverse.
Yeah, they were already there.
Just anticipating that this is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're an interesting spot at Forbes because we have a great cryptocurrency and blockchain coverage. We did a big blockchain issue, and we had the Winklevoss twins on the cover, and then we created an NFT of the cover, and we sold it for charity to support journalists that are kind of in tough regimes and maybe imprisoned. But that just we raised $500,000 from that NFT, and this is a magazine print and media is having trouble always with revenue. The fact that we just made $500,000, we didn't keep it. But that's amazing. And now we have a big investment recently from Binance, the big crypto firm, and we're excited for them to kind of take their expertise and bring Forbes into this metaverse, whatever that looks like. In terms of trends, at least in America, we're having a huge issue with government with trust right now. Right. As you can see, as everyone's living through COVID, there's almost not say civil war, but half the country fighting against masks, not trusting vaccines, the other half really following it. So you can't every time the government now puts out a message, whether it's a a commercial, an alert, a press conference with Dr. Fauci, half the country thinks it's a lie and a hoax.
Right.
So that's a major problem. So forget technology, like that's a cultural change where, a decade ago, people more or less didn't trust the government 100%, but they assumed that they weren't questioning something like, get a vaccine, it will save your life. Now it splits a room in half, or it splits the country in half. It's also obviously regional, but that's very interesting, especially when you have now social media, everyone can comment, everyone can, if the government puts a post, someone else can go right below that and say that's a lie. So it's like, think about that. So you kind of have these critics and dissenters are in the conversation. So how that changes, if I knew, I'd be a billionaire. But that's very, very interesting.
I think that's one of the interesting things in this part of the world is government is much more trusted.
Yeah.
And so there's a responsibility in communication to maintain that trust. And, we both have seen what happens when government is not trusted and how that information gets disseminated. So I think that, you're starting at an advantage here in the sense that if you can build on that trust and come up with the systems that engage your constituencies and not be afraid of that interactive communication, I think that trust will grow because younger people are generally more cynical anyway. And if you could find a way to co-opt that cynicism early on and build on the trust that already exists, I think that's a winning strategy for at least this part of the world. And it's a real advantage because it is these social channels and these new means of communication that actually are fragmenting society. So it's a delicate balance, but it's where government, I think, should step up and have a real responsibility.
It is incredible. I mean, in the UAE with the Edelman Trust Barometer, annually you get above 70%, 80% of trust in authority, which is incredible because in parts of I came from the UK here, and the distinction is huge.
Yeah, some homework for everyone here who's not from America. Go on Twitter and see an official post from Joe Biden or Governor DeSantis in Florida or Governor Belsom in California, and then look at the comments in the bottom. I'm sure you'd have very different comments there than you would in this region, for sure.
Okay, so we don't have too much time. So there's 3 topics I want us to touch upon in about 6 minutes. So we're going to have to be quick.
Round.
All right,
Here we go. Get the timer out. 2 minutes.
Most important lessons learned from COVID and communication during COVID.
I'd say be prompt. Make sure that you let people know what you know and what you don't know, so that because this changed as we went, and if you had been definitive and said this is absolutely what happens, and then you have to change your mind, you've lost all that credibility. So I'd say, and keep up to date, and then make sure there's channels for feedback. People had questions. You can't anticipate everything people want to know. So I'd say those are my lessons.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think speed, but being accurate. Forbes has always been kind of quick, but over COVID, we started a breaking news channel, which was crazy. We started a breaking news YouTube channel as well. So it's all about speed, and also with the way social media and the digital engagement is, you never know where a story is going to go. If you have a message, once it hits social media and the memes, it might take a whole life of its own. So it's very unpredictable.
Yeah, and you have to accept that. That's part of it.
You got to accept it.
Okay.
I mean, look at the Oscars. I mean, come on, that was
Okay, so my second quick question for you is, if a government is thinking about upskilling civil servants or some of its public affairs officials, where should they be looking to?
Well, what we've done as a company is we've embedded people in the agencies to teach and work side by side with people in the government until it's almost like build, operate, transfer. It's, help people get the skills, help them understand what kind of infrastructure they need, and then, then you go on and help somebody else. So I think that's one place. And I think another place is don't be afraid to have there be reverse mentoring as you bring younger people in. It's something that, I've learned a lot from a lot of the younger people in our firm, and I would say that's another place to go.
Less of an upskill, but it's more of a mindset that people really have to realize now that content wants to be free, information wants to be free. And if you're not transparent, if you're telling half-truths, if you're holding back stuff, it will get out and it's going to backfire in your face. So it's always, a lot of people in government always want to kind of hold information, keep it tight, but you really got to realize that it's going to get out there and you have to prepare for that. And it's always better to be transparent at first than having to backpedal or kind of cover up what happened. So it's very tricky.
One other thing I would just say in terms of the future and how things are different is there's also a mindset that a story has to be in one of the major global publications for it to be real or for it to mean anything. And they're looking for that big headline, when in fact you can see the environment with your story. And you can get a lot more out there, a lot more reach by going through these channels and making sure that what exists online is, it sends the right messages to the right audiences and that it's truthful. And that will help you get that bigger story at some point too. But, people like to start at the other end and reverse engineer the whole thing, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, and that goes back to your point about being authentic and being in touch with what people want. Okay, and so then my final question for you both is, as we are here in the World Government Summit, we're thinking about major geopolitics, but we're also thinking about digitization. There's a lot talking about digital tools and so forth. But for you, you personally, not your entities, but you personally, if you want to go and verify information, if you want to be sure this is actually right, where do you go, and how can governments make sure that they are amongst those sources that you would go to?
That's a really good question. I think for me, I like to check multiple channels of information. And I'm lucky I live in a global world. My personal world is pretty global, that I can check and double check information from different perspectives and come up with my own judgment on that. And so I don't rely on any one channel of information. And so I think for governments to be part of my selection process for information.
How do they make the cut?
I think they need to earn a reputation for putting out information that is factual and is not, they're not trying to persuade me, they're trying to educate me.
Yeah, 100%. Again, you have to kind of look at the market, so to speak, and read different sources. Personally, I think kind of the news wires tend to be less political. So in an AP or Reuters, or those sort of just like fact-based companies are always a good way to kind of test the baseline. These news wires that feed the magazines and newspapers, because I trust a lot of newspapers, but a lot of newspapers have different bends, left or right or center. News wires tend to be pretty straightforward, so that's always a good place to at least start.
That's great. Thank you both so much for your time. Great insights, and I think at the heart of it, as you said, it's trust and authenticity. So the tools may be different, but at the heart of it, communication, the art of storytelling really hasn't changed that much. It's just how we're telling the stories. Thank you for your time. Please thank our panel.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.